Hey, hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about something super interesting, which is how we can use homoglyphs to attack the systems that are able to tell when you have written something with ChatGPT, Gemini, or any chatbot essentially. But before we dive into that, I'd just like to give you a few notes about how the presentation is going to work that I think are important. The first of them is that there's always a trade-off. And in this presentation, I'm going to try to be more accessible than precise. Many of the things that I will say are not accurate, but I'm going to do that just for the sake of trying to make everything easy to understand. If you want precision, however, don't worry, I'll put the references in the slide. So you just need to, make a note, and then I'll give you a QR code at the end, and you can go and check that out. Last thing, I'm going to put some pink boxes at the end of each section. That's a takeaway, that's something we should remember for the end of the presentation. We'll summarize everything very nicely at the end of the presentation, so that's a thing that I will tell you, oh, we should remember this thing, okay? So, we're ready to get started, and let's dive right into it. First of all, what are homoglyphs? What's this thing that I was talking about at first? Well, I'll just give you an example. Let's say that we have a bunch of A's, right? Like here you can see that I have like a lot of A's, but the question is, which one of these is the thing that I would get if I type letter A on my keyboard? It's not all of them, it's just one of them. It's the second one. The other ones are, I don't know, like for example, letter alpha, mathematical symbols. They are not the encoding for letter A. They don't have the same number, and that's the key. Homoglyphs in general are characters that may seem identical, but they are not identical. They are characters that have different encodings. And that's not something new. That had past applications like, I don't know, URL attacks. You know, when you get like a phishing text and it says, click here, PayPal, and it's like a different URL, it's something else. But it sort of looks like the original thing, like you would write like a mathematical symbol inside the URL and you try to trick the person to go into a different URL. That's something that was a past application. It's patched now. But another thing that we can try to use also for that is just hiding information. It's what's called steganography, like essentially hiding data in plain sight. Like if you find letter alpha in this text, then you should, I don't know, trigger the exploit or something like that. Like just using homoglyphs to sort of put information that people can't see inside the text. Very interesting area. But in general, the idea that we just need to remember for this presentation is that homoglyphs are characters that we can't discern, at least at plain sight. And now that we have like a little bit of background about what are homoglyphs and how they work, let's talk a little bit about how we can detect AI-generated text. And for that, I'm going to focus on three main families of systems. There's more, but I think these are like the most important ones. First, there's a thing that we call a classifier. And the idea is very simple. I give you a text, you use a model. It doesn't have to be like an LLM necessarily, but just a model that you trained on a lot of texts, and it's able to, for example, generate an embedding, or just think like a pointing space, if I represent that pointing space, like here you can see that we have like a 2D space, it's a point here. And in this case, it's one of the red points, which mean that those were AI-generated texts. So essentially, the model takes a lot of texts, and it's able to say whether a text has been AI-generated or not by placing it in the 2D space here. So that's it for classifiers. But now if we talk a little bit about perplexity-based detectors, that gets perhaps maybe even more interesting, because that is about how LLMs really work. And well, let me just make a few notes here. How do they work? I'll just explain that for the purposes of this presentation. I'm not going to explain them in general because they are very complicated, but you can just think it's like a sort of fill the gap game. So if you have a phrase like this, right, like as a hobby, I like to collect, fill the gap, and you pass that to an LLM, your LLM is going to give you a probability distribution. And that probability distribution can look like this, right? Like I like to collect things, I like to collect books, etc. So what we do now is we just pick one of the things that are more likely. For example, books. As a hobby, I like to collect books. That's something that's AI generated, but it really makes sense, right? It's sensible. And if we take something that's human written, such as a hobby, I like to collect bracelets, that's different, right? Like, let's go back to the probability distribution. We can see that bracelets is actually very unlikely. Like, our model, our language model, wouldn't have written bracelets because it doesn't think it's very likely to collect bracelets. So the idea here is books has a high probability, bracelets has a low probability. In other words, books doesn't surprise the LLM if the LLM sees that word, while bracelets does, and that means that something is AI generated or human written. That's what we can use to predict if a text has been written by an AI or a human. Now, let's have a few words on watermarks and how we can use them to detect AI generated text. This is something that's like, you know, on the news. Like, if you just read the news sometimes, you will probably come across things about OpenAI having like a watermark for ChatGPT. What's this about? Well, let's remember the probability distribution that we had like a minute ago. It looked like this, right? And like what I did before was literally just choosing one of the things here. I just said, okay, I'm going to pick books because it's likely. You know, it's a 21% likelihood. Yeah, okay, I'm going to pick that thing. Now, what a watermark does is that we pick a rule for our choices. And it could look like this. For example, you pick the nth word. And how do you choose n? Well, n is going to be the number of letters that you had in the word preceding that word. So, for example, as a hobby, I like to collect, and collect has 1, 2, 7 letters, right? So 7 letters, that means that I need to go to my probability distribution here, and I start counting. Things, books, stamps, coins, postcards, shells, plants. Plants, okay, that's the 7th word, that's my choice. It can't be any other choice because I have a rule. And now that's what I do. I complete the sentence, and this is not only AI generated, but also watermarked. I can use my rule to predict if essentially like the text has been written by AI or not. We repeat this process, of course, for all of the words that we write, and you know, if there's a lot of words that follow this rule, we can probably say it's AI generated. So, in general, takeaway here, we have like a lot of techniques to detect if like a text has been written by AI. Now, the question becomes, well, can we maybe use like homoglyphs to attack those systems? Can we do something with them? Because if you think about it, like if I take a text and I replace some of the characters here, I was replacing characters by, like, for example, letters in other languages, etc. And it looks the same, right? Like, it really looks like you wouldn't be able to tell the two texts apart if I hadn't literally, you know, like colored the characters in red. But to a computer, they look super different. This is what happens when we process the text. We tokenize the text, and that means essentially turning the text into numbers. And what you can see here is that there's a huge difference, right? Like the numbers are very, very different. There's like a lot of numbers that change, and that's the key. What we see is this. We see the same text, right? But the computer doesn't see the same text. It sees something like this. As a hub, something I don't understand. So that's the key. Homoglyph-based attacks have a very strong effect in making the text unrecognizable. That's the main idea. Now, let me explain how this works from a more technical point of view. Let's talk about classifiers. What happens to them specifically? Well, you will remember that we had like a plot like this, right? We had some points that were very clearly classified as AI, and they were separate from the blue things, which are human. So essentially, you would be able to very easily distinguish if something has been generated by AI or not by knowing if it lands close to the red or the blue points. But let's see what happens if we take the same texts. Literally what I did was taking the same texts and plotting them again after using homoglyphs on them. And what happens is this. And there's two very important things to sort of like highlight here. The first of them is that you can see that it's like literally in a very different region of space, right? Like it's completely separate. So if I ask you the question, is this green dot part of the red or the blue dot? Well, it's hard to tell, right? Because it's very far from them. So like even if you tried to like, I don't know, redraw like your classification threshold, it would be very hard. But on top of that, they are super mixed, which makes things even harder, because like in the red and blue dots, there's a very clear boundary. Like you can literally see where the boundary is, like around 5, 10, somewhere between those numbers. But now, where's the boundary, really? Like, there's purple things that go into the green region, and green things go into the purple region. So they are super mixed. It's very hard to redraw like a boundary for classification, and that basically renders those classifications probably very ineffective. So, complicated things on the classifiers, but what happens to the ones that are based on perplexity? Well, that was the phrase that we had, right? Like, as a hobby, I like to collect books, and what we did was we just chose one of the highly likely words, right? Books was very likely, according to our model. But the problem here is that if what we have is something that I don't understand as a hobby, something I don't understand, and we go back to the probability distribution, what's the probability of something I don't understand? Well, it's super unlikely because like the system would never write this very strange word that I don't really know what it is, right? So suddenly the text becomes very surprising for the model, which essentially means that it's going to be classified as human written. If the text is not surprising, it's AI written. If the text is surprising, like here, it's human written. So that is probably going to have an effect on systems that are based on perplexity. And if we talk about watermarks, which was the third type of system, what happens to this? What's going on here? Well, let's just recap a little bit. Again, we have like the same phrase, right? As a hobby, I like to collect plants. That was the seventh word. We had like this rule in the watermarks that said essentially that you pick the nth word. And how do you choose n? Well, it's a number of letters in the word that is before that word. Now, if we have something like this, we could say, oh, well, this weird thing is not a letter, so probably the word is lagged. And if I take lagged, well, that's 5 letters. So let's go to our probability distribution. Oh, the fifth word is postcards. But postcards is not what I had. I had plants. So this doesn't follow the rule. Oh, it's human written. So all of the let's say, mechanisms of action exploit this idea of confusion. They just make the system sort of unable to understand what's going on here. And, well, that really complicates things. And let's have like a little bit of talk on effectiveness. What happens here? Well, I'll show you some results, experimental results here. We have 1,000 human texts and 1,000 generated texts. And what we can see here is that for a specific classifier, this is just one of the different classifiers I studied, we have a very good classification. We can see that most of the texts that are human are classified as human, and most of the texts that are generated are actually classified as such. So that's very good. That's what we would like to see. This is perfect. But the question is, what happens if we start putting homoglyphs here? This is what happens. Everything is classified as human in this case. But, well, you could say, oh, okay, maybe, like you just cherry-picked like a specific example, maybe this is the case for this detector, but it doesn't work in general. Could be. Let's see what happens. So here I studied like a lot of detectors in different data sets, and I was taking a look at what was their original scores. You can see them on the left here, right? Like some of them are very good, some of them are not good, but really there are some of them that in general are good systems. And the question is, will they also be very vulnerable to these attacks, as we just saw with the first of the examples? Well, it turns out they very much are. A lot. They are super vulnerable. We can see that, scores are very close to zero, and that is a strong result. That is very, very strong as an experimental result, and it means that homoglyphs are highly effective. They are able to essentially render all of the detectors very ineffective. So that's something to start thinking about. What can we do? Can we do something about it? What are the implications of this thing? And of course, you will have probably a lot of thoughts in your mind right now, like academic misconduct, cheating, fraud, social engineering. What happens with fake news if, news media can start publishing things written by AI and we can't detect that? That's hard. But maybe what makes me more worried is that the access barrier for this, essentially the resources that you need to be able to apply that technique, are super, like, well, negligible. Really, you don't need anything. You just need a Python script. Usually, if you want to evade detectors, there are other techniques to try to do that, but you usually need to rewrite the text with paraphrasing, which takes like GPUs and compute power, and it takes time, and it's not easy to essentially like try to evade the detectors. It takes time. It is hard. But the problem is that homoglyphs, they are everywhere. It's like super easy. Like literally, like I implemented like a web interface to do that. It's super simple. It's super simple. Like anyone could do that. So there's a super low access barrier, and that makes me very worried. And you could say, well, it's all right. Don't be so dramatic. There's safeguards. We can do things. For example, something that we could try to do is we can just check if there's a homoglyph in the text. The homoglyphs are like, I don't know, characters in Russian or characters with accents or things like that. So we just, have like a blacklist and we just filter them out. And, well, I would say like probably yes and no. That works to a certain extent. Like if you just consider like texts in English, it does generally work, unless you use words inside of the text that are, I don't know, crap or things like that, and you write it like with an accent. In general, I would say that in English it could work, but the problem is that when you generalize to texts in general, for example, like scientific articles or texts in, I don't know, Spanish or French or Chinese or other languages, input constraints don't really work. That's something for another talk. But the idea is that that's not so simple. So there's a lot of work that we need to do here. We need to keep innovating. We need to do real research work to try to see if we can do something. And that brings me to the end of the presentation, and that brings me to the recap. You remember we had like those pink boxes. So let's go back to them. Let's remember what we talked about. First, we talked about homoglyphs, characters that we can't discern. We don't really know if they are like Russian A or Latin A. And we also had like a little bit of like a background on the detection of AI-generated text. How can we know if something has been written by ChatGPT? There's different techniques, but when we apply homoglyph-based attacks, the text just becomes unrecognizable. And if it becomes unrecognizable, we are sort of able to exploit this idea of confusing the system. That's very effective. That renders all of the detectors that I tried, a lot of them actually, well, ineffective. They don't work. They are very bad at detecting the texts. And on top of that, this is super easy to use. A super low access barrier, anyone can use it. So AI-generated text detectors are unreliable in general, not just because of homoglyphs. They are very unreliable in general, but perhaps that's another thing that really supports the idea of their unreliability. So in general, there's a lot of work to do. We need to keep innovating. We need to keep making things better. And speaking about making things better, I have a feedback form. If you can cover that, it's like just a super short form that you can fill in like 15 seconds. I promise I made it very short. And if you fill in the form, you will get the bibliography. Also my LinkedIn, I think, website, like a lot of things. All of the contents that I included, like the papers that this is based on, everything is here when you scan the link. So please, if you can take 20 seconds just to tell me how you found the presentation. Was it too technical, too simple? Anything you would like to see, something that you didn't understand? Anything helps me improve. So having said that, I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope to see you very soon again. Thank you. Goodbye.